Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, is there a paper on your desk tonight still waiting to be answered, its seal unbroken, its message postponed? Watson learned that even the oldest documents keep faithful record of the truth. Do subscribe so no page goes unread. Now, settle in. For as Holmes believed, nothing once written is ever truly silent. Find us too on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel, linked below in the description. Chapter 1. The Gentleman of Bedford Square. It was in the early days of November, when the fogs of London had already begun to settle upon the city, like some grey and patient beast, that I was witness to the opening of one of the more curious cases in which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes ever involved himself. I have, in the course of these memoirs, endeavoured to set down only those matters which seem to me most illustrative of his singular powers of reasoning, and I confess that the affair of Sir Edmund Vale's arrest warrant has long remained fixed in my memory, not merely for the ingenuity of its solution, but for the melancholy truth which lay beneath it. The morning in question was raw and yellow-tinged, the sort that makes a man grateful for his own fireside, and I had come round to Baker Street with no more pressing purpose than to share a late breakfast with Holmes, whom I had not seen in the better part of a week. I found him in his dressing gown, seated at the table with the newspapers spread about him in that chaotic fashion which Mrs. Hudson so despaired of, and his violin lying silent upon the sideboard, a sure sign that his mind was not at that moment occupied with idle amusement. "You're restless, Holmes," I observed, as I took my accustomed chair. "I know the signs. You have had no case worthy of the name in a fortnight, and it tells upon you." "You grow perceptive in your old age, Watson," said he, with that faint smile which was, in him, the equivalent of another man's laughter. "I have indeed been reduced to the study of cigarette ash and the classification of tobacco, which, whatever its scientific merit, does little to quicken the pulse. But I think our idleness is about to end, for I hear a heavy and official tread upon the stair, and unless I am very much mistaken, it belongs to our friend Gregson." He had scarcely finished speaking when there came a knock at the door, and Inspector Tobias Gregson entered, his fair hair somewhat disordered beneath his hat, and his countenance wearing that expression of controlled urgency which I had come to associate with matters of real gravity. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I'm sorry to intrude upon your breakfast, but I have a case here that I think will interest you, if only because I cannot make head nor tail of it myself." "Sit down, Gregson, and have some coffee," said Holmes. "You will find that a case explained over breakfast is invariably more digestible than one explained on an empty stomach. Now, tell us what troubles you." Gregson seated himself, though I observed he did not touch the coffee, being too preoccupied to attend to such comforts. "You will have heard, perhaps, of Sir Edmund Vale," he began. "The retired magistrate of Bedford Square," said Holmes. "I know something of him. A man of considerable reputation for severity upon the bench, and a still more considerable reputation for rectitude off it. Pray continue." "Just so. Well, Mr. Holmes, an old matter has come back to trouble him. Some 15 years ago, a warrant was issued for the arrest of a clerk named Nathaniel Crowe, who was employed in the administration of a charitable trust under Sir Edmund's supervision. It was alleged that Crowe had made away with a considerable sum of the trust's funds. The man fled the country before we could lay hands upon him, and it was generally believed that he had died abroad, for nothing was heard of him for years afterward." "And now," said Holmes, leaning forward with that quickening of interest which I knew so well. "Now, Mr. Holmes, it appears that Crowe has returned to London. The old warrant has resurfaced from Sir Edmund's private archive, where it has lain undisturbed, and more troubling still, Sir Edmund has begun receiving anonymous messages. One of them read, 'If you will credit it, that the warrant will speak before the man does.'" Holmes's eyes had taken on that bright, hard glitter which I associated with the scent of a genuine problem. "A curious phrase," said he softly, "and an ominous one. Tell me, Gregson, what is your own reading of the matter? I confess I hardly know what to make of it. Sir Edmund is anxious, though he affects otherwise. He insists the whole business is of a little consequence, an old and settled affair, but he has asked for police protection all the same, which is scarcely the conduct of an untroubled man. We shall go to him directly, said Holmes, rising with sudden energy and reaching for his coat. Watson, if you have no other engagement this morning, I should value your company. There is something in this narrative, Gregson, which promises to reward closer examination. The resurrection of a warrant so long dormant, the return of a man believed dead, and a message so carefully chosen in its wording. Come, let us not keep Sir Edmund waiting. We found the gentleman in question in his study, a spare, upright man of perhaps 70 years, with the bearing of one long accustomed to authority, and a countenance schooled to impassivity by decades upon the bench. He received us with a courtesy that was correct in every particular, and yet I could not but notice, as Holmes turned the conversation toward Nathaniel Crowe, a certain rigidity that crept into his posture, and more tellingly, the manner in which his hand, resting upon the arm of his chair, tightened suddenly upon the wood until the knuckles whitened. I remember the affair only vaguely, said Sir Edmund in a voice of practised indifference. It was a great while ago, and Crowe was, I believe, a man of weak character who succumbed to temptation. I see no reason why his return, if indeed he has returned, should occasion any particular alarm. Holmes said nothing of the hand upon the chair, but I saw that he had marked it, as he marked all things, and as we took our leave some minutes later, he remarked to me in a low voice upon the pavement, "A vague memory, Watson, does not commonly clench a man's fist until the wood groans beneath it. I think we have been shown, quite unintentionally, the first true clue in this affair, and it lies not in any document, but in the gentleman himself." Chapter 2. An Orderly House. We returned to Bedford Square upon the following afternoon at Holmes's particular request, for he had expressed a wish to see the household in its ordinary routine rather than in the agitation of a first interview. Sir Edmund's residence was a tall Georgian house of grey stone, its windows curtained in a manner so precise, its brass so uniformly polished, that I was moved to remark upon the impression it made. "It has," said I as we mounted the steps, "the air of a place where nothing is ever out of order." "You have expressed it better than I could myself," Holmes replied. And indeed, when I came afterward to set down my recollections of that day, I could find no phrase more exact than that the house possessed the oppressive perfection of a room in which nothing had ever been permitted to happen unexpectedly. There was a stillness to it that seemed less the product of peace than of vigilance, as though every object had been arranged not for comfort but for inspection. We were received by Thomas Reed, the butler, a man of perhaps 60 years, grey and dignified, whose manner toward us was correct to the point of severity, though I detected beneath it a watchfulness that seemed to me, even then, somewhat greater than the occasion warranted. He conducted us to the drawing-room, where we were presently joined by the remainder of the household. Miss Eleanor Vale, Sir Edmund's niece, was the first to enter, a young woman of composed and intelligent countenance, who managed, I was given to understand, the whole of her uncle's correspondence and domestic affairs. She greeted us with a calm courtesy that betrayed nothing beyond a natural concern for her uncle's welfare, though her eyes, dark and quick, moved often to Holmes's face as though she sought to read there some verdict he had not yet pronounced. She was followed by Mr. Henry Lascelles, Vale's solicitor, a spare and meticulous gentleman whose black coat was brushed to a state of unnatural perfection, and who spoke of the affair with the careful, measured diction of a man accustomed to weighing every word before he releases it. Dr. Samuel Marlowe, the family physician, came next, a stout and genial man whose long acquaintance with Sir Edmund seemed to sit upon him as a mixture of affection and fatigue. And last of all there entered Arthur Crowe, the younger brother of the fugitive clerk, a neat, quiet accountant of perhaps 40 years, who bore himself throughout the interview with the anxious diffidence of a man who feels himself suspected of a crime he has not committed. "You will understand, gentlemen," said Sir Edmund when we were at length assembled, "that I have nothing to conceal in this household. Every person here will answer whatever questions Mr. Holmes may put to them." "That is generous of you," said Holmes, and I shall take you at your word. But it is not in the first instance the household I wish to examine. It is the warrant itself." Sir Edmund inclined his head, and at his direction Lascelles produced from a dispatch box a folded document, somewhat yellowed with age, which he laid upon the table before us with the reverence of a man handling a relic. "This," said Sir Edmund, "is the original warrant issued for the arrest of Nathaniel Crowe. It has lain in my private archive these 15 years, until it was disturbed a few days since." Holmes drew the paper toward him, and studied it in silence for some minutes, turning it once toward the light of the window, and once again examining the reverse. I watched his face, as I had watched it upon 100 similar occasions, for some sign of the conclusions passing behind that impassive countenance, but he gave nothing away beyond a certain deliberate slowness in his movements, which told me that his interest was thoroughly engaged. The document itself appeared, to my own inexpert eye, entirely unremarkable. A formal warrant, signed, sealed in black wax, and dated in a clerkish hand some 15 years before. I could discover nothing in it to justify the closeness of Holmes's scrutiny, and yet I had learned long since that what escaped my notice was frequently the very substance of his interest. At length he set the paper down and looked round upon the assembled company with that air of quiet attention which seldom failed to produce in a room a certain uneasy silence. "I have but one question," said he, "and I put it to you all. Who expected this document to be examined again?" The silence that followed was, I thought, more eloquent than any answer could have been. Lascelles frowned faintly, as though the question offended his sense of order. Eleanor Vale's hands, folded in her lap, grew for a moment quite still. Dr. Marlowe shook his head with the puzzled air of a man who finds himself asked to solve a riddle in a foreign tongue. Arthur Crowe said nothing at all, but I observed that his gaze had fallen to the floor. Even Sir Edmund, from his chair by the fire, offered no reply beyond a slight, dismissive movement of the hand, as though the question were unworthy of serious consideration. "No one, it would appear," said Holmes at last, with a faint dryness in his tone, "had thought the matter would ever again see the light of day, and yet here it is resurrected at precisely the moment when its resurrection can do the most harm. That, gentlemen, is not the way of chance, it is the way of design." We remained the better part of an hour longer, during which Holmes questioned each member of the household in turn upon matters that seemed to me, at the time, of only tangential relevance. The hours kept by the household, the security of the private archive, the persons who possessed keys to it, and gathered, I could see, a great store of small and disconnected facts whose bearing upon the case I could not yet perceive. It was as we were preparing to take our leave that Sir Edmund made the announcement which was to give the affair its sudden and dramatic turn. "I have resolved," said he, addressing Holmes with a firmness that seemed to cost him some effort, "to meet with Nathaniel Crowe myself privately tomorrow evening, and to put the old matter to rest once and for all." Holmes regarded him for a long moment before replying, "That is a bold resolution, Sir Edmund." "It is a necessary one." We said nothing further until we were once more upon the pavement, walking beneath the darkening sky toward the cab-stand at the corner. "Watson," said Holmes then, in a low voice, "did you remark his choice of words?" "He spoke of putting the matter to rest." "He did." And I confess the phrase troubles me more than any threat could have done, for a man who speaks of resting an old quarrel does not commonly clench his hand upon his chair, nor summon police protection against the very party he professes to forgive. I think, Watson, that Sir Edmund does not intend reconciliation tomorrow evening. I think he intends settlement, and settlement, in a man of his history, is seldom a gentle word. Chapter 3. The Arrest That Never Occurred. The following evening brought with it a fog so dense that the lamps of Baker Street burned like dim orange moons within it, and I well remember remarking to Holmes, as we sat awaiting news from Bedford Square, that such a night seemed a fitting stage for whatever was to come. He made no reply, being occupied at that hour in the cleaning of his revolver, a task he performed with the same meticulous attention he brought to every other pursuit, and I confess I thought little of it until, some time after 9 o'clock, there came a violent ringing at the bell below, and we heard upon the stair the unmistakable tread of Gregson, taking the steps 2 at a time. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, bursting into the room without ceremony, "you must come at once. There has been an attack at Sir Edmund's house." "Vale himself," said Holmes, rising instantly. "Struck down in his library not an hour since. He lives, but the doctor cannot yet say how gravely he is injured. And Crow, Mr. Holmes, Crow was never taken. The men I sent to make the arrest found no trace of him. We were in a cab within the minute, rattling through streets rendered nearly invisible by the fog, and Gregson, seated opposite us, related what particulars he had gathered, in a voice made unsteady by the haste of his errand. Sir Edmund, it appeared, had given instructions that Nathaniel Crow was to be arrested that evening under the old warrant, the moment he presented himself for their appointed interview. Police officers had been posted accordingly. But the hour of the meeting came and went, and Crow did not appear. It was only when the household grew alarmed at Sir Edmund's prolonged silence that Reed had gone to the library and discovered his master lying insensible upon the floor near the great desk, a thin trickle of blood upon his temple. "The cabinet where the private papers are kept had been forced open," Gregson continued, "and the original warrant, the very one Mr. Holmes examined yesterday, is gone. Taken, we must suppose, by whoever struck him down." "And Sir Edmund himself?" I asked. "Can he give no account?" "Very little, Doctor. He recalls hearing someone enter the room, and then nothing more until he woke to find Reed bending over him." We reached Bedford Square to find the house ablaze with lamps and full of that particular hush which follows swiftly upon violence. Servants standing in doorways with white faces, a constable stationed uneasily in the hall, and from above, the low murmur of Dr. Marlowe's voice attending his patient. Holmes went first to the library, and I followed close behind him, my own professional instincts already engaged, though it was Marlowe, and not I, who had charge of the injured man. The library was a long, handsome room, lined with books to the ceiling, and it presented at first glance a scene of only moderate disorder. A chair lay somewhat askew near the hearth, the cabinet stood open, its lock forced, and upon the carpet before the great writing desk there was a small dark stain which I need not describe more particularly to my readers. Yet as I looked about me, I found myself echoing, without quite intending it, an observation Holmes had made of the house itself upon our first visit, for even in its disorder, the room seemed somehow too composed, too readily comprehensible, as though violence had passed through it, and left behind not chaos but a kind of arrangement. Holmes moved about the chamber with that swift, silent economy of motion, which I had observed in him on 100 occasions, kneeling here to examine the carpet, pausing there to study the cabinet's broken lock, and at last standing motionless before the window for the better part of a minute, though I could see nothing there to reward such attention. "You will have formed a theory, Gregson," said he at length. "I have, and I think it a sound one. Crow learned that the old warrant had been unearthed, and that his arrest was intended this very night. He came here, not to the appointed interview but earlier in secret, to destroy the paper before it could be used against him. Sir Edmund surprised him at the cabinet, and in the struggle that followed, Crow struck him down and made his escape with the warrant. We have, moreover, a witness, a woman living opposite, who says she saw a man answering Crow's description loitering near the square not 20 minutes before the alarm was raised." "It is a coherent theory," said Holmes, "and I do not doubt that a jury would find it a comfortable one, yet I confess it does not satisfy me." "And why not, Mr. Holmes?" "Because, Gregson, look about you. Where is the struggle you describe? A chair is out of place, one chair, and that but slightly. The cabinet lock is forced, certainly, but forced with a neatness that suggests leisure rather than desperation. There is no second stain upon the carpet, no overturned lamp, no torn curtain, nothing of that violent disarray one expects when two men grapple in earnest, one of them a man of 70 years struck down by a stronger opponent. I have seen rooms after a genuine struggle. Watson can attest to it, and they do not look like this. I confirmed, from my own experience, that this was so, for I had attended more than one patient in the aftermath of violence, and the surrounding wreckage was seldom so restrained as what I saw before me now. "Then what do you make of it?" Gregson demanded, with the note of a man whose patience, though considerable, has limits. "I make of it," said Holmes slowly, "that the room has been arranged to tell us a story. Whether that story is wholly false or only partly so, I cannot yet say. But it has been arranged, Gregson, with a very particular audience in mind, an audience inclined, as you yourself are inclined, to read a chair and a broken lock and a rumour of Crow's presence and construct from them a comfortable and complete narrative. You suggest someone else struck him down and left these things to point toward Crow. I suggest nothing yet with certainty. I observe only that a story has been laid before us with unusual care, and that a man does not commonly trouble himself to write so careful a story, unless he fears that a less careful one would not be believed." Holmes turned from the window at last and looked round the quiet room, the books rising into shadow above the lamplight, the small dark stain upon the carpet, the chair not quite in its place. "Someone arranged this room to tell us a story, Watson," he said again, more softly. "The question that concerns me is why they believed we would be so eager to read it." We remained at the house until the small hours, while Marlowe attended Sir Edmund and pronounced with cautious optimism that his patient would live, though he could not yet say when, or whether his memory of the evening's events might return with any clarity. Holmes said little more that night, but I observed him, before we departed, pause once again beside the writing desk and stoop, very briefly, to examine something upon the floor beneath it, a movement so slight that I do not believe even Gregson remarked it, and of which Holmes himself said nothing at all until several days had passed. Chapter 4. 3 Motives and 1 Design. 2 days passed before Holmes spoke to me at any length of what he had discovered beneath Sir Edmund's writing desk, and in the interval he had not been idle, for I knew from long experience that his silences were never empty ones. He had been abroad at all hours, consulting, as I later learned, the records of Vale's old court, the household accounts kept by Lascelles, and even the register of a small hotel near the river, where, it transpired, Nathaniel Crow had been lodging under an assumed name since his return to England some weeks before. It was upon the 3rd morning that he laid before me, upon the breakfast table, a full accounting of what the investigation had thus far produced, and I confess that the sheer profusion of motive which he had uncovered left me more bewildered than enlightened. "Consider, Watson, the company gathered in that house," said he, pushing aside his plate and lighting his pipe with the deliberation of a man about to lecture. "We have Arthur Crow, who may well wish to shield his brother from a second and more serious accusation, whatever protestations of peaceable intent he offers us. We have Eleanor Vale, who stands to inherit the greater part of her uncle's very considerable fortune, and who has, moreover, spoken to me with a composure I find somewhat too perfect for a young woman whose guardian lies gravely injured under her own roof. We have Lascelles, who confided to me yesterday with evident reluctance that he has recently discovered certain irregularities in Sir Edmund's financial accounts, irregularities he had not yet found occasion to raise with his client. We have Dr. Marlowe, an old friend of the family, who knows, by his own admission, a great deal more of Vale's private history than he has yet chosen to share with us. And we have Reed, the butler, whose son was dismissed from his post some years ago under circumstances Reed himself described to me as humiliating, though he would not elaborate further. It is a formidable list, I said. Gregson, I think, would say it proves too much, that with so many possible hands raised against him, one can scarcely single out the guilty one. Gregson has said precisely that, and I confess it is not an unreasonable position for a man of his methods. But I take the opposite view, Watson, and I hold to it with some confidence. When a single motive lies exposed before us, we may reasonably suppose it genuine, for a guilty man rarely advertises his own reasons. But when 5 motives lie exposed together, each as visible as the last, each offered up almost before it was asked for, I begin to suspect not the abundance of guilt but the deliberate construction of confusion. Too many motives, my dear fellow, have been placed conveniently within our reach. We went again that afternoon to Bedford Square, where Sir Edmund, though weak, had recovered sufficient strength to receive occasional visitors, and where Holmes, rather than pressing him with questions, asked leave to examine the library once more in solitude. I accompanied him, and I watched as he went about the room with a thoroughness even beyond what I had witnessed on the night of the attack, measuring distances with his tape, examining the carpet upon his hands and knees, and once holding a lens so close to the surface of a bookshelf that his breath must nearly have clouded it. "Come here, Watson, and tell me what you observe of this chair," said he, indicating the same chair which had stood, upon the night of the attack, somewhat out of its accustomed place. I examined it as best I could, though I confess my eyes not trained to such minute particulars as his. It stands, I should say, some 8 or 10 inches from where the mark upon the carpet shows it ordinarily to rest. Just so. And observe the mark itself, the depression left by the chair's feet, worn into the carpet by years of undisturbed use. The chair was moved, Watson, but moved gently and set down again with care, not flung aside in the heat of a struggle. A man defending his life does not pause to consider where a chair ought properly to stand. He turned next to the cabinet, running his finger along the topmost shelf and holding it up for my inspection, though I could discern nothing remarkable upon it. Dust, Watson, or rather, the absence of it. This shelf has not been disturbed in a great while, save for one section here, some 6 inches in breadth, from which the dust has been quite recently removed. Wiped away, I should say, rather than merely handled. Someone wished us to believe that papers were withdrawn from this precise spot in haste, but haste does not commonly trouble itself to leave so tidy an impression. From the cabinet he proceeded to the window, where he drew my attention to a series of fine scratches upon the brass of the latch, fresh, as you may see by the brightness of the metal beneath them, and made, I should judge, by something narrower and harder than a gloved hand or a jemmy properly employed for forcing an entry. They suggest an escape through this window, Watson, and yet the ground without is soft from yesterday's rain, and I found, upon my examination this morning before you arrived, not a single footprint beneath it. Then the window was never used at all? I believe not. It was scratched, I think, to suggest that it was. It was at this point that he knelt once more beside the great writing desk, and drew from his waistcoat pocket a small twist of paper, which he opened with great care upon his palm. Within it lay a fragment scarcely larger than a grain of wheat, dark red in colour, and faintly glossy where the light caught it. "I found this beneath the desk on the night of the attack," said he, "in the same spot where Sir Edmund fell. Sealing wax, Watson, and red. Observe the colour closely, for it will not disappoint you to remember it. Yet the warrant which was stolen from that cabinet, as we saw with our own eyes at our first visit to this house, was sealed in black. I confess the significance of so small an object escaped me entirely. Perhaps it fell from some other document in the cabinet." "Perhaps," said Holmes, folding the fragment once more into its paper, and returning it to his pocket without further explanation, though I saw in his eye that he had already carried the thought a good deal further than he chose for the present to share with me. "But I do not think so, Watson. I think this small red fragment was carried into this room from somewhere else, entirely, and that whoever brought it here did not know he had done so. A man may arrange a chair and wipe a shelf and scratch a window latch with great deliberation, and yet betray himself in a single particular he never thought to consider at all. That is generally how these matters resolve themselves, in my experience, not through the schemes a man constructs, but through the one detail he forgets to construct." He rose, brushing the dust from his knees, and stood for a moment surveying the room with an expression I had learned to recognise as the quiet satisfaction of a hunter who has at last found the trail he sought. "The person who arranged this affair," he said softly, "was thinking not merely of escape, Watson, but of interpretation. He wished us to read a particular story in this room. Our task now is not merely to ask what happened here, but to ask why he was so very anxious that we should believe it. Chapter 5. The Weight of Conscience. In the days that followed, Holmes altered his method of inquiry in a manner that struck me, at first, as a curious departure from his usual directness. Rather than pressing the household with questions touching upon the attack itself, the hour of its occurrence, the sound heard or unheard, the position of this object or that, he turned instead to a subject seemingly remote from the violence in the library, the character and history of Nathaniel Crowe. "You will observe, Watson," said he, as we walked once more toward Bedford Square upon a grey and blustering afternoon, "that a man who wishes to conceal a recent fact will generally take great care in guarding it, and very little care at all in guarding an old one, for he does not suppose the old fact to be dangerous. I intend, therefore, to ask a great many questions about matters 15 years old, and to see what falls, unguarded, from the answers." It was Arthur Crowe whom he sought first, and we found the accountant in a small sitting-room set aside for his use, a neat spare chamber that seemed to reflect something of the man's own careful and anxious temperament. He received us with the wary courtesy of one who has grown accustomed to being regarded with suspicion, and I confess I felt for him a measure of sympathy even before Holmes had begun to speak. "Mr. Crowe," said Holmes, seating himself without ceremony, "I will be plain with you, since I think plainness will serve us both better than delicacy. Your brother returned to England some weeks before this trouble began. I have confirmed as much from the register of a hotel near the river. I ask you now, quite simply, whether you knew of it." Arthur Crowe hesitated only a moment before answering, and I thought I saw in that hesitation not deceit, but the weighing of a long-carried burden. "I did, Mr. Holmes. Nathaniel wrote to me some 6 weeks ago from France to say he intended to come home. He had grown weary, he said, of living under a name not his own, and weary above all of a guilt he insisted he had never earned. He maintained his innocence then, even to you, his own brother, in private correspondence where no jury and no reputation stood to be gained by the claim. He maintained it, Mr. Holmes, with a bitterness that has never once wavered in 15 years. He told me, and I didn't credit it at first, for it seemed too monstrous, that the funds were never his to take. He said that Sir Edmund himself had diverted money from the charitable trust to conceal a debt owed by some prominent family, whose embarrassment, had it become public, would have done Sir Edmund's own reputation considerable harm. Nathaniel discovered the diversion in the course of his ordinary duties, and when he taxed Sir Edmund with it and threatened to expose the matter, the warrant for his own arrest followed within the fortnight. I confess I heard this recital with a mixture of astonishment and disquiet, for it cast the whole affair in a light very different from that in which it had first appeared to us. Holmes, however, received it with no outward sign of surprise, merely inclining his head as though a piece long expected had at last dropped into its place. "You believe him?" said he. "I've come to believe him, Mr. Holmes, though it has cost me a great deal to do so. I do not say it to excuse whatever wrong he may since have done. I say it only because it is, so far as I know it, the truth." We left Arthur Crowe to his solitary anxieties and sought next an interview with Eleanor Vale, whom we found in the small study adjoining her uncle's bedchamber, engaged in the sorting of correspondence with a composure that had not, so far as I could judge, deserted her once throughout the whole distressing business. Holmes questioned her at first upon matters of household routine, and then, with the same quiet indirection he had employed with Arthur Crowe, turned the conversation toward her uncle's recent habits. "I have noticed," said he, "that Sir Edmund has of late been much occupied with old papers." Miss Vale's hand, I observed, paused for the briefest instant above the letter she had been folding. "He has been burning correspondence, Mr. Holmes, these past several weeks. I did not think it my place to inquire into the nature of it. He is not a man who welcomes questions concerning his private affairs. And this began, if I am not mistaken, some time before the warrant itself was disturbed." "I believe it did, though I could not say precisely when." Holmes thanked her with a courtesy that gave no hint of the significance he plainly attached to her answer, and we passed on to Dr. Marlowe, whom we discovered below in the small morning room, awaiting our arrival with the air of a man who had rehearsed and half regretted what he intended to say. "I have attended Sir Edmund now for above 20 years," said the physician, when Holmes had pressed him gently upon the state of his old friend's health and temper, "and I have never known him so troubled as he has been these past 2 months, long before ever this attack took place. He asked me once, and I confess the question sat oddly with me at the time, whether a man's heart might fail under the burden of an accusation long delayed. I told him that anxiety was ill for any heart, his own included, and urged him to unburden himself of whatever weighed upon him, whether to myself or to his solicitor. He would not." Holmes said little as we walked back toward Baker Street through the gathering dusk, though I could see that his mind was very actively engaged, and it was not until we had regained our own fireside that he spoke again at any length upon the matter. "You perceive, Watson, the pattern that emerges. Arthur Crowe knows a portion of the truth, and shields his brother's memory with it. Eleanor Vale knows that her uncle has been destroying evidence of some kind, and shields him by her silence. Marlowe knows that his old friend's conscience has been troubling him for 2 months past. 2 months, Watson, which is very much longer than the fortnight since this warrant first resurfaced, and he shields him also, though more from professional discretion than from affection, I think. Nearly everyone in that house, my dear fellow, holds some fragment of the truth, and nearly everyone has chosen to protect someone else with it, rather than deliver it whole to us. It makes our task the harder," said I. "On the contrary, it makes our task very much easier. For a household of liars acting from fear will generally contradict one another within a week. A household of liars acting from loyalty, however, will hold together with a consistency that fear alone could never produce. Fear produces lies, Watson. Loyalty produces better ones, and it is loyalty, unless I am very much mistaken, that we have been contending with in that house from the very first." Chapter 6. What the warrant actually said. It was upon the following morning that Holmes announced his intention of visiting the courts, a proceeding which surprised me somewhat, for I had supposed that everything of consequence touching the warrant had already been examined at Bedford Square. When I said as much, he answered only that a copy examined in a private house and a copy preserved under official seal were, in his experience, 2 very different documents, however identical they might appear at first glance, and that he did not care to build his conclusions upon the former when the latter lay within reach. We spent the better part of that day, therefore, in the dim and dust-laden chambers where the records of Sir Edmund's old court were kept, Holmes conversing at some length with a clerk of great age and greater patience, until at last the official copy of the warrant issued 15 years before for the arrest of Nathaniel Crowe was produced and laid before us upon a long table. I confess that to my own eye the document appeared, upon first inspection, so nearly identical to the one we had examined at Sir Edmund's house that I could discover no material difference between them. Both bore the same date, the same court, the same formal language of arrest. Holmes, however, read the 2 side by side, for he had brought with him a careful transcription he had made, upon our earlier visit, of the warrant shown us by Sir Edmund, with a slowness that told me he had found something worth the finding. "Watson," said he at last, in a voice from which he had not entirely banished a note of quiet triumph, "read me this passage from the official record, and then read me the corresponding passage from my transcription of the warrant we saw at Bedford Square." I did as he asked, and even upon a first reading the discrepancy declared itself plainly enough. The official record charged Nathaniel Crowe with the fraudulent appropriation of trust funds, and with that offence alone. The warrant which Sir Edmund had produced for our inspection, however, charged him additionally with forgery, an accusation which appeared nowhere in the record properly filed and preserved by the court. "One accusation has been added," said Holmes, "and added, moreover, with very considerable skill, for I confess that had I not possessed this transcription to compare against the original, I might never have remarked the alteration at all. Do you perceive its significance, Watson?" I confess I did not immediately, and said so. "Consider what a charge of forgery permits, that a charge of simple appropriation does not. A warrant for appropriation entitles the police to search for and seize the money itself, or such records as pertain directly to its disappearance. But a warrant for forgery, Watson, entitles them to seize a man's private papers wholesale, upon the theory that any document in his possession may bear upon the offence. It is a far broader net, and one cast, I think, not to catch Nathaniel Crowe at all, but to catch whatever papers he might have been keeping. Papers which, had they come to light through ordinary means, could have done considerable damage to another man's reputation. The implication settled upon me with the weight of a thing long half suspected, and now suddenly confirmed. You mean that the warrant was altered to give the police the right to search Crowe's rooms for evidence against Sir Edmund himself?" "I mean precisely that, Watson. Consider the sequence as Arthur Crowe has already given it to us. Nathaniel discovers that Sir Edmund has diverted trust funds to conceal a debt belonging to some prominent family. He threatens exposure. Within a fortnight a warrant is issued against him, not for the offence he threatened to reveal, for that would have implicated Sir Edmund in the very act of pursuing him, but for an offence he had, so far as we know, never committed at all. And that warrant is quietly broadened in its final drafting, to permit a search wide enough to recover and destroy whatever proof Nathaniel possessed of Sir Edmund's own guilt. Crowe did not simply flee an arrest, Watson. He fled a prosecution manufactured whole and entire to silence him." I sat for some while in silence, turning over in my mind the singular reversal which this discovery worked upon the whole character of the case. The man we had regarded from the very outset as a fugitive from justice, a thief who had preyed upon a charitable trust and vanished rather than face the consequence of his own dishonesty, now appeared before us as something very nearly its opposite. A man who had uncovered the dishonesty of another and been driven from his own country by the machinery of law itself, wielded against him not in the service of justice but in its betrayal. "It is a grave thing you are suggesting, Holmes," said I at last. "A magistrate who alters process against an innocent man is guilty of a crime very much graver than any Crowe was ever accused of committing." "It is grave, Watson, and I do not offer the suggestion lightly, nor do I offer it as proven beyond all further inquiry. But I have learned, in the course of many years at this work, to trust a document more than I trust a reputation, for a reputation may be cultivated with great patience over a long life, while a document, once written, retains its original meaning whatever protestations may afterward be built up around it. The official record says one thing, the private warrant says another. Somewhere between those two sayings lies the truth of what was done to Nathaniel Crowe 15 years ago, and I begin to suspect it is a truth Sir Edmund has spent every year since labouring quite successfully until now to keep buried." We returned to Baker Street as the lamps were being lit along the streets, and I found myself for the remainder of that evening unable to regard the case with the simplicity that had characterised my first understanding of it. The morally ambiguous fugitive of our earlier inquiries had become, in the space of a single afternoon's research, something closer to the injured party and a wrong committed against him by the very machinery meant to guard the innocent. And the eminent respected magistrate who had summoned us to his aid now stood revealed, in Holmes's careful reconstruction, as the true architect of an old and carefully concealed injustice. And yet Holmes, when I ventured to observe as much, was quick to temper my conclusions with a caution I have since had frequent occasion to remember. "You run ahead of the evidence, Watson, as you're sometimes inclined to do when a case takes a dramatic turn. That Sir Edmund wronged Nathaniel Crowe 15 years ago, I now believe with a fair degree of confidence. But a man's old sins, however grave, do not of themselves tell us who struck him down in his library 3 nights past. A great many people in that house had reason to hate Sir Edmund, once the truth of his conduct became known to them. Reason to hate a man, however, is not the same thing as proof that a man was struck, A man's sins may explain why others come to despise him. They do not by themselves prove who raised the hand against him. Chapter 7. Nathaniel Crow's Confession. We had scarcely finished our breakfast upon the following morning when a message arrived from Gregson, so hastily written that the ink had blotted in 2 places, informing us that Nathaniel Crow had that very hour presented himself at Scotland Yard and made a full confession to the assault upon Sir Edmund Vale. "That is swift work," I remarked, as Holmes read the note a second time with a frown that seemed to me more perplexed than satisfied. "Too swift, perhaps," said he, folding the paper and reaching for his hat. "A man who has evaded justice for 15 years does not commonly surrender himself within a week of returning to England, unless he has some very particular reason for doing so. Come, Watson, let us hear what he has to say for himself." We found Gregson in a state of considerable satisfaction when we reached the yard, for the confession, taken down that morning in the presence of 2 constables, appeared to close the case with a completeness that left, in his estimation, very little further to be desired. Nathaniel Crow himself, when we were admitted to see him, proved to be a thin, grey-haired man of perhaps 50 years, whose face bore the marks of a long exile more plainly than any words could have expressed it, and who received our questions with a curious composure, as of a man who has already made his peace with whatever consequence must follow. "I have told the inspector everything," said he, when Holmes had introduced himself. "I entered Sir Edmund's library that night, meaning to find and destroy the warrant before it could be used against me a second time. He came upon me at the cabinet. We quarrelled, I will not pretend otherwise, and in my anger I struck him. I took the warrant and fled by the window. I am not proud of what I did, Mr. Holmes, but I will not deny it." "You knew the house well, I understand," said Holmes, "from your years of former employment under Sir Edmund's administration of the trust." "Well enough to find my way to the library in the dark, if that is your meaning." "And you were seen near the square that evening, by a witness who has since identified you with some confidence." "I do not doubt it. I made no particular effort to conceal myself, having by then resolved upon my course." Gregson, who had listened to this exchange with the satisfaction of a man watching his own theory confirmed in every particular, could not forbear from adding his own summary of the case as we withdrew a little apart. "You will observe, Mr. Holmes, that everything falls precisely into place. He knew the house. He had the strongest possible motive, whatever gloss Mr. Arthur Crow may since have put upon it. His presence in London that night is beyond dispute, and he possesses knowledge of the missing warrant, its removal, its route of escape by the window, which only the man who took it could reasonably be expected to know. I confess that I too found myself persuaded by the sheer accumulation of circumstance, and said as much to Holmes when Gregson had gone to attend to some further formality of the arrest. It fits together very neatly, Holmes. Perhaps after all our theory of an arranged room was mistaken, and the confession is simply the truth we have been seeking. "Perhaps," said Holmes, though without conviction, and I saw that his eyes had not left Nathaniel Crow, who sat now with his hands folded upon the table before him, watching us with an expression I found difficult to read, not defiance, nor quite despair, but something nearer to a grim and settled resignation. Holmes returned to him and asked, in a tone so mild that I thought at first the question idle, "One matter troubles me, Mr. Crow, and I hope you will forgive my asking it, though it can have little bearing now upon your confession. When Sir Edmund attempted to defend himself against you, which hand did he raise?" Nathaniel Crow answered without the least hesitation, "His right." Holmes said nothing further. He thanked the prisoner with a courtesy that gave no hint of what had passed behind his eyes at the answer, and within a very few minutes had taken his leave of the chamber altogether, walking so swiftly toward the street that I was obliged to hasten my own step to keep pace with him. "Holmes," said I, once we had gained the pavement, "why did that question end the interview so abruptly? I confess I saw nothing remarkable in his answer." "Because, Watson," said he, stopping at last and turning to face me with an expression in which I saw, for the first time in some days, the particular light that came into his countenance when a case had turned decisively beneath his hand. Sir Edmund Vale has been incapable of raising his right arm above his shoulder for nearly 6 years. I learned it from Dr. Marlowe only yesterday, in the course of our conversation regarding his patient's general health, and thought nothing of it at the time beyond its bearing upon his constitution. A rheumatic affliction of the shoulder, Marlowe called it, the legacy of a fall some years since, and one which has never fully mended. A man so afflicted does not raise his right arm to defend himself against a blow. He could not have done so that night in the library, whatever Nathaniel Crowe now tells us he witnessed. Then Crowe has lied. Crowe has confessed to a crime he did not commit, Watson, and confessed to it with a particularity of detail that suggests not simple invention but instruction. For a man inventing a confession from whole cloth to protect himself would scarcely trouble to furnish so precise and so easily disproved a particular as the hand with which his victim struck at him. He has been told what to say by someone who believed the detail would strengthen the confession, and who did not know, any more than Crowe himself knew, of Sir Edmund's old injury. That is not the confession of a guilty man protecting himself. That is the confession of an innocent man protecting someone else. We walked some way in silence after that, through streets grown busy with the ordinary traffic of the morning before Holmes spoke again, and when he did, his voice had taken on a gravity I had not often heard in him. Somewhere in that household, Watson, a person of very considerable resource has constructed not one false story, but two. First the story told by the room itself, and now this second story, told through the mouth of a man persuaded to believe he was protecting someone he loved. We have been very cleverly managed from the first, and I confess I begin to admire, even as I mean to defeat, the intelligence that has managed us. Chapter 8. The Red Wax. Holmes said nothing further of his intentions until the following afternoon, when he announced, with the sudden decisiveness that generally marked the resumption of an inquiry he had been quietly pursuing beneath an appearance of idleness, that we were to return once more to Bedford Square. "I have a fragment of red wax in my pocket, Watson," said he, as we took our seats in the cab, "which has waited a full week now for its explanation, and I think the time has come to demand one of it." We found the household in a state of subdued disorder occasioned by Sir Edmund's slow but steady recovery, and by the general knowledge, now filtering through the servants' hall in whispered fragments, that Nathaniel Crowe's confession had failed in some particular to satisfy the detective who had been called in to examine it. Holmes asked first for Mr. Lascelles, and we were shown into the small room set aside for the solicitor's use when he attended upon his client's affairs, a chamber as neat and as precisely ordered as the man himself. "I wish to ask you," said Holmes, when the customary courtesies had been exchanged, "a question touching your professional habits. What manner of sealing wax do you employ in your office?" Lascelles regarded the question with evident surprise, though he answered readily enough. "Red, Mr. Holmes, for all private correspondence not requiring the formality of the firm's own seal. It is a common enough choice among men of my profession. Black is reserved, in the general practice of the courts, for documents of a more official character, the warrants, judgments, and the like. And you had occasion, I think, to visit this house recently, bringing papers from your office?" "I did, upon the very afternoon preceding the attack. I brought several documents touching Sir Edmund's estate which required his signature, and left them with Reed to be placed upon his desk, as I had an appointment elsewhere, and could not wait upon my client in person." Holmes thanked him, and we withdrew, and I observed, as we passed once more into the hall, that his countenance had taken on that particular stillness which I had learned to associate not with satisfaction, but with the deliberate suppression of it, as though he wished to carry a conclusion a good deal further before permitting himself to rejoice in it. When we returned that evening to Baker Street, Gregson was awaiting us, and it was to him that Holmes at last confided the matter of the red wax, producing the small fragment once more from its twist of paper and laying it upon the table between them. "Lascelles has confirmed that red wax is the common practice of his office," said Holmes, "and that he was in this very house, with papers so sealed, upon the afternoon before the attack. I think, Gregson, You will find in this the makings of a new theory, and I confess I'm curious to hear you construct it." Gregson took up the fragment and turned it in the lamplight with the air of a man well pleased to have something tangible at last to reason from. "It seems plain enough to me, Mr. Holmes. Lascelles discovered, in the course of his examination of Vale's accounts, the very irregularities he confessed to you some days since. Suppose he pressed the matter further than he has admitted, and learned the whole extent of Sir Edmund's old corruption, the altered warrant, the ruin of an innocent man. Suppose further that he confronted Vale with this knowledge, that violence followed, and that he took the warrant himself, meaning to use it, perhaps, as a lever against his own client, or perhaps merely to suppress a scandal that would have ruined the firm's reputation along with Vale's own. And suppose, finally, that it was Lascelles who persuaded Nathaniel Crowe to confess, for a solicitor of his standing would have little difficulty in finding a means of communicating with a fugitive, nor in framing a confession calculated to close the matter beyond further inquiry. It is ingeniously constructed," said Holmes, "and I do not doubt it would satisfy a jury nearly as readily as your former theory of Crowe's own guilt satisfied you a week ago. But I think, Gregson, that you build once again upon a single fact without examining that fact closely enough to bear the weight you place upon it. Look again at the wax." Gregson held the fragment nearer the lamp, turning it slowly, but confessed after a moment that he could discover nothing in its appearance beyond its colour. "Observe the underside," said Holmes, taking it from him and indicating a small, flattened surface scarcely visible to the naked eye. This fragment did not fall, drop by drop, from a stick of wax held above the library floor, for had it done so, it would show the rounded, gathered shape of wax cooling as it strikes a surface, a shape I have had frequent occasion to study, and one this fragment does not possess. Instead, one entire face of it is flat and slightly compressed, as though it had already hardened elsewhere, upon some hard and level surface, and was afterward pressed a second time beneath a considerable weight. I put it to you, Gregson, that this wax did not fall in the library at all. It was carried into the library, already hardened, caught upon the sole of someone's shoe. I confess this observation, when Holmes had made it plain, seemed to me so obvious in retrospect that I wondered I had not perceived it myself, though I knew well enough that such was invariably my experience of his reasoning, impenetrable until explained, and self-evident thereafter. "If the wax was carried upon a shoe," said Gregson slowly, "then we have only to discover whose shoe carried it." "Precisely so, and I have already taken the liberty of examining the household's footwear, upon a pretext I need not trouble you with, during our visit this afternoon while you and Watson were engaged with Lascelles in the small room below." Holmes drew from his pocket a slip of paper, upon which he had evidently made some private notation. "Only one pair of shoes in that house bears a heel sufficiently damaged, sufficiently split along its edge, to catch and hold so small a fragment without dislodging it in the course of ordinary walking. They belong, Gregson, to Thomas Reed, the butler." There was a silence in the room following this announcement which I did not care to break, for I had already begun to perceive, dimly, the shape of a conclusion I did not yet wish to draw. Gregson, for his part, showed no such reluctance. "Then Reed is our man, Mr. Holmes. He collected Lascelles' papers that afternoon, as we know he did, and carried the wax into the library upon his shoe when he entered it that night. He was present in the library certainly at some point before or during the events of that evening. The wax proves that much, and proves it, I think, beyond serious dispute." Holmes rose and stood for a moment before the fire, his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude I had come to recognise as preceding some careful qualification of an argument that might otherwise be pressed too far. "But I would counsel you, Gregson, against the haste which has already led you once to a conclusion this case did not upon closer examination support. A footprint or a fragment of wax carried upon a shoe identifies a presence in a room. It does not of itself identify the hand that struck the blow within it. We have found, I think, a man who was there. We have not yet found, with certainty, the man who acted. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the crime. It was upon the 5th day following our discovery of the wax that Holmes at last declared himself ready to bring the affair to its conclusion, and he did so in a manner characteristic of him upon such occasions, by requesting that the whole company be gathered once more in the very room where the mystery had begun. Sir Edmund, though still pale and moving with the careful deliberation of a man not yet fully recovered, insisted upon receiving us in the library itself, seated in a great chair drawn near the fire, and it was there that Gregson assembled, at Holmes's particular direction, Eleanor Vale, Lascelles, Dr. Marlowe, Thomas Reed, Arthur Crowe, and, brought under guard from his place of confinement, Nathaniel Crowe himself. I have attended a good many such gatherings in the course of my long association with Holmes, and I confess I never grew entirely accustomed to the particular tension that settled upon a room in the moments before he began to speak, a silence in which each person present seemed conscious that some portion of the truth about to be revealed concerned himself, and waited, with what composure he could summon, to learn how large or how small that portion might prove. "I will begin," said Holmes, standing before the cold hearth with his hands clasped behind him, "by stating plainly that the confession offered to Scotland Yard some days ago by Mr. Nathaniel Crowe was false in every particular save one, his presence in London upon the night in question." Nathaniel Crowe made as if to speak, but Holmes raised a hand not unkindly and continued, "You confessed, Mr. Crowe, because you believed the true offender to be someone you were determined to protect. You believed, I think, that Eleanor Vale herself had struck her uncle down, and you offered yourself in her place, out of a sense of debt for the wrong once done your family beneath this very roof." A sound, quickly suppressed, escaped from Eleanor Vale, and I saw Nathaniel Crowe's gaze turn to her with an expression in which astonishment and something very near to tenderness were mingled in equal measure. "You are mistaken in your particulars, though not, I think, in the general shape of your loyalty," Holmes went on. "It was indeed Miss Vale who first uncovered the truth of what her uncle had done 15 years ago. In sorting his private papers, as her duties required of her, she came upon correspondence which proved beyond doubt that Sir Edmund had himself diverted funds from the charitable trust, and had altered the warrant against Nathaniel Crowe to permit the seizure and destruction of evidence that might have exposed him. Sir Edmund, from his chair by the fire, said nothing, but I observed that his hand had once more closed upon the arm of it, as it had done upon the very first morning of our acquaintance with this unhappy family. Miss Vale confronted her uncle with what she had found," Holmes continued. "Sir Edmund refused to acknowledge his guilt, and resolved instead to destroy what remained of the evidence before it could be used against him, a resolution which explains, I think, the burning of correspondence which Dr. Marlowe and Miss Vale herself have both remarked upon these past 2 months, and which began, you will recall, a considerable time before the warrant itself was ever disturbed. This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes," said Lascelles, though without great conviction. "It is conjecture confirmed by documents I have this week obtained, at Miss Vale's own assistance, from her uncle's remaining papers, and I will produce them for Gregson's inspection before this interview concludes. But let me proceed. Thomas Reed overheard the confrontation between uncle and niece. He has served this family, and Miss Vale in particular, since she was a child left orphaned and placed under her uncle's guardianship, and his loyalty to her, I think, exceeds, by a considerable measure, whatever loyalty he retains towards Sir Edmund himself, a loyalty already strained, as we have established, by the humiliating dismissal of his own son some years past." Reed, standing very still near the door, said nothing, but his face had gone the colour of ash. Reed resolved to act. He entered this library later that evening, intending only to remove the warrant and such other papers as remained, before Sir Edmund could destroy them, and thereby erase the last proof of an old injustice. He carried with him, unknowingly, upon the damaged heel of his shoe, a fragment of red sealing wax picked up earlier that afternoon, while collecting papers from Mr. Lascelles's parcel in the hall below. Sir Edmund discovered him at the cabinet. A struggle followed, not the violent struggle Gregson first supposed, but a brief and unequal one, for Sir Edmund is a man of 70 years, encumbered besides by a shoulder that has not served him properly in 6 years, while Reed is considerably the younger and the stronger. "I never meant him serious harm," said Reed, and his voice, when it came at last, was low and unsteady. "God is my witness, Mr. Holmes, I never meant it." "I believe you," said Holmes, not unkindly. "Sir Edmund attempted to seize the warrant from your hands. You pushed him away, meaning only to free yourself, and he fell against the edge of this very desk and struck his head and lay senseless upon the floor. And then, Reed, you did what I think many a frightened man has done before you, and will do again. You mistook panic for wisdom. Rather than summon help and confess what had occurred, an accident born of no worse intent than the protection of a young woman you loved as your own, you set about arranging this room to tell a different story altogether." He turned as he spoke, and indicated in succession. The chair moved gently from its place. The dust wiped clean along one section of the cabinet shelf, the fresh scratches upon the window latch. Each of these details, we now know, was your own careful construction, Reed, designed to suggest a desperate intruder who had forced his way in and fled again by the window. It very nearly succeeded. It failed only because a genuine struggle leaves behind a violence of disorder which a manufactured one, however carefully composed, can never quite achieve, and because you could not, in your haste, remove the one thing you did not know you had brought with you into this room at all. "The wax," I said, before I could check myself. "The wax," Holmes agreed, "and there remains one further thread to draw together. Nathaniel Crowe, learning somehow, I think from a whispered word among the servants, or perhaps from Arthur himself, that Eleanor Vale had confronted her uncle shortly before the attack, leapt to the conclusion that she and not Reed had struck the blow, and resolved to shield her with a confession of his own, framing it as best he could from such fragments of the true events as had reached him. It was an act of considerable courage, Mr. Crowe, however mistaken in its object, and I do not think the law will judge it as harshly as you perhaps feared it might." The room remained silent for some moments after Holmes had finished speaking, broken at last by Sir Edmund himself, who spoke for the first time since our arrival, his voice thin but not without its old note of authority. "You have constructed a very complete account, Mr. Holmes. I do not know that I can dispute it." "I do not ask you to dispute it, Sir Edmund," said Holmes gravely. "I ask you only to understand what it establishes and what it does not. Reed did not intend you serious harm, and the law, I think, will weigh that fact with some mercy. But he deliberately concealed the truth of what occurred in this room, and deliberately arranged matters so that another man, an innocent man, already once grievously wronged by your own hand, should bear the suspicion of a crime he had not committed. Your own offences, 15 years old though they are, do not excuse that concealment. Law may sometimes fail morality, Sir Edmund, but morality cannot be repaired by falsifying fact, whatever the kindness of the motive behind the falsehood. Chapter 10, Law and Mercy. The weeks that followed Sir Edmund's recovery brought with them a train of consequences which he had plainly never anticipated when first he summoned us to Bedford Square upon that grey November morning. The documents which Holmes had obtained through Eleanor Vale's assistance, together with the official record we had examined at the courts, were laid before the proper authorities, and it was not many days before the truth of the old affair became a matter of settled record rather than mere private suspicion. Nathaniel Crowe's name was formally cleared. The court which had once issued a warrant broadened beyond its lawful scope to serve a private purpose now acknowledged, with what grace such institutions can muster in confessing their own old errors, that he had been the victim of a prosecution manufactured to silence rather than to punish. An inquiry was opened, moreover, into Sir Edmund's original manipulation of the warrant and his misuse of the charitable trust he had once administered, and though I will not weary my readers with the tedious particulars of that proceeding, I may say that it concluded very much as Holmes had foretold it would, with Sir Edmund's public reputation, so carefully cultivated across the whole of a long career, dismantled within the space of a single season. Reed's case, by contrast, resolved itself with rather more of mercy in its final measure than I had privately expected. Sir Edmund, whether from some late and imperfect stirring of conscience, or from a shrewd recognition that a public trial would expose his own conduct to still closer scrutiny, declined to press the most serious charge that might have been brought against the butler. The injury, it was acknowledged on all sides, had resulted from a struggle rather than a premeditated assault, and Reed's own candid admission of what he had done, once Holmes's reconstruction had left him no further room for denial, told in his favour before the magistrate. He received, in the end, a comparatively limited punishment for obstruction, and for the tampering with evidence which his careful arrangement of the library had constituted, a sentence which Holmes, when I remarked upon its leniency, observed was very likely the most just outcome the case could have produced, given the tangled loyalties from which the man's crime had sprung. Nathaniel Crowe, his name cleared and his false confession set aside, was released within the week, and I confess I felt a considerable satisfaction, of a kind not always afforded a medical man in the ordinary course of his practice, in learning some months later that he and Arthur had taken rooms together, and that the two brothers, separated for so long by exile and suspicion, had begun at last to rebuild something of the life the old injustice had cost them. Eleanor Vale did not remain beneath her uncle's roof. She removed herself from that household within a month of the inquiry's conclusion, and devoted herself, I was given to understand, to the restoration of the charitable trust, whose funds her uncle had misappropriated so many years before, a labour which struck me when I heard of it as a fitting and quietly courageous answer to the wrong in which she had so unwillingly discovered her own family's part. It was upon a wet evening some months after the affair had reached its conclusion that Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street, the case by then settled in every particular that the law could reach, and I found myself turning the whole matter over in my mind with a persistence I had not expected it to retain. "I confess, Holmes," said I, "that I find it difficult to decide even now whom justice has truly served in this affair. Sir Edmund was the victim of the crime that first brought us into the case, and yet he was the author of a far older and graver injustice. Reed broke the law in the very act of attempting to right a wrong that law itself had failed to correct, and Nathaniel Crowe lied to the police, out of a love so mistaken in its object that it very nearly cost an innocent man his liberty a second time. I cannot find, in the whole of it, a single figure whose conduct I can approve without reservation." Holmes considered this for some while before replying, his pipe sending up its thin blue thread of smoke into the lamplight. "You look for a clean resolution, Watson, as you're generally inclined to do, and I do not think this case, of all the cases we have shared, was ever going to furnish you with one. But I would caution you against a particular danger in your reasoning, my dear fellow, the danger of allowing sympathy to determine fact. It is a very natural inclination, and a very dangerous one in men who must decide what is true. Sir Edmund's old wrong does not excuse Reed's concealment of the truth, however sympathetic we may find his motive. Reed's loyalty does not excuse Nathaniel's false confession, however moving we may find the impulse that produced it. Each fact must be established upon its own evidence, Watson, and judged upon its own merits, or the whole structure of what we call justice becomes no more than a reflection of whichever party we happen, in our own hearts, to have already forgiven." "And yet," said I, "surely mercy has some part to play in such matters, or the law becomes a thing without humanity in it at all." "Mercy has every part to play, Watson, in the question of what punishment a man deserves once the truth of his conduct has been established. I do not dispute that Reed's sentence was rightly tempered by the circumstances of his crime, nor that Sir Edmund's downfall carries with it a certain melancholy, which even I, who have little patience for men of his stamp, am not wholly immune to feeling. But mercy has no proper part to play in the prior question of what actually occurred in that library on the night Sir Edmund was struck down. That question admits of only one honest answer, arrived at through evidence and reason alone, and it is only once that answer has been honestly secured that mercy may be permitted to do its gentler work upon whatever consequence follows from it." I said nothing further for some time, content to sit in the warmth of our own fireside and turn his words over in the quiet of my own reflection. And it seemed to me, as I've had occasion to reflect many times since, that in the whole tangled history of Sir Edmund Vale and the warrant that bore silent witness against him across 15 patient years, no truth had been more plainly demonstrated than this: that mercy may properly influence the punishment a man receives, but only reason can establish what he has actually done, and that without that foundation of established truth, neither law nor mercy can ever rightly know where to begin.